Logitech's G900 Chaos Spectrum wireless gaming mouse provides professional-grade performance, their most accurate sensor, and innovative design features. See the URL in the description to learn more. Hey everybody, welcome back to PC Perspective. I'm Ryan Shrout. Today we're going to talk about another new graphics card. This time it's the GeForce GTX 1070 from NVIDIA. We have already seen the specifications for this. They kind of officially released them on GeForce.com, so there's not a whole lot of surprises or secrets here anymore. They announced the 1070 at the same time they announced the 1080, so we know it's the same kind of ID and design style to it. There's still going to be a Founders Edition and a not Founders Editions from a bunch of different add-in board vendors. But let's go ahead and talk about what the specifications are and what our performance results actually looked like. So in terms of specs, you're looking at 1920 CUDA cores. That's 33% less than the GTX 1080. So it's a sizable drop there from the 2560 of that particular part. And all the other texture units, ROPs, those all kind of scale accordingly. The base clock on this is 1506 megahertz with a typical boost clock of 1683. So again, a little bit lower than what we saw on the GTX 1080, but still very impressive clock speeds to see boost clock almost at 1700 megahertz. It has 8 gigs of memory still. At this time it's GDDR5, not GDDR5X, and it's running at 8 gigabits per second instead of 10 gigabits per second. So you do get a little bit of reduction in your actual memory bandwidth. But again, it's kind of in balance with the compute throughput of that many CUDA cores at that clock speed as well. So it does kind of work out. It is a GP104 GPU, so it's the same piece of silicon that exists in the GTX 1080, just cut down a little bit. These are ones that didn't quite make the grade for 1080 or couldn't hit the clock speeds they needed to get or whatever. And also, to benefit from that, we're dropping the TDP from 180 to 150 watts. So the GTX 1070 has a 150 watt rather TDP. It's still built on the 16 nanometer process technology, all the benefits thereof. One single 8-pin power connector. Again, sharing basically the same board design and infrastructure that the GTX 1080 had over to the GTX 1070. In terms of architecture, I'm not really going to go into any details on this because if you're eager to learn about this, you've probably been following the Pascal release in the GTX 1080 since its beginning. You still have the same minor architectural shifts that occurred from Maxwell to Pascal. We've talked about those extensively in other videos. You do have the addition of features like you have simultaneous multi-projection support, additional HDR and video encode support, VR performance improvements. All that stuff still carries over to the GTX 1070 pretty much across the board. Pricing-wise, the GTX 1070 has two prices, as did the 1080. $379 is its MSRP and $449 for the Founders Edition. The one we're reviewing and the one that's going to be available at first on June 10th is the Founders Edition. This is the kind of renamed, rebadged reference design from NVIDIA that's now going to last the entire lifespan of the product that never really happened before. So that will still be a debate amongst people, and it's a legitimate concern from everyone, right? It was a $100 price difference on the GTX 1080. Now it's a $70 price difference. I'm sorry, an $80 price difference between that on the 1070. So again, we'll probably end up deciding that if you can wait for the add-in card versions that are going to be closer to $379, it's always going to be better for you there. Now let's look at performance. There's lots of cards to compare this to, as it happens when you're in kind of the middle of the stack if you're not at the super high end. Compared to a GTX 980, for example, at 1080p, this GTX 1070 is anywhere from 15 to 40% faster depending on the game. Now, for this round of benchmarks, we actually did 1920 by 1080 and 2560 by 1440 resolution testing, leaving 4K for the higher end cards, and for some additional testing when we get in our second 1070, for example, to do SLI performance. At 1440p, we're looking at the 1070 being about 45% faster than the GTX 980. That's pretty impressive. If you look at the 970, so the similar classification from the last generation, you're looking anywhere from 45 to actually 100% faster than the 970 is this new Pascal-based card. And it's never, at 2560 by 1440, it's never less than 57% faster across the board. So that's pretty impressive as well. From a 980 Ti standpoint, this is equivalent performance to the 980 Ti, actually a little bit above it. In my testing, it's anywhere from 1 to 2 to 7 to 8% faster than the 980 Ti from last generation, kind of the flagship, highest-end consumer graphics card. And that's really impressive, again, going with the MSRP of $379, and even still pretty impressive with the $449 price tag of the Founders Edition, considering the 980 Ti up until a couple weeks ago was a $649 video card. If you want to compare the new Pascal products, 1070 is going to be anywhere from 20 to 25% slower than the GTX 1080. The only exceptions to that are a handful of games at 1080p where the GPU is not the dramatic bottleneck that it is at higher resolutions, and so the differences become a little bit less obvious there. If we look at the AMD landscape, the primary competitors for this card are the Radeon R9 390X and the Radeon R9 Nano. The Nano sells for $499 today. The 390X you can actually get for as low as $329 today, so that's actually a pretty impressive part. Both of those are slower than the GTX 1070, and sometimes by significant margins, up to 40% for the Radeon R9 Nano and up to 52% against the R9 390X. There are a couple of instances where the 390X is actually tied with the GTX 1070. Those are both at 1080p resolution, and they're both kind of in the less GPU intense of the titles that we've looked at, right? But there is some interesting stuff that occurs at 1080p where, as we kind of expected, all of these cards are very powerful, and so the CPU becomes a little bit more of an issue in terms of performance. And that being said, we're even using a Haswell E 8-core 16-thread processor as our testing platform as well. So interesting numbers there that you can get all the details at in our full review over at PCPer.com. So clearly, the GTX 1070 is an awesome card. It is faster than the 980 Ti, so it's going to be faster than the Fury and the Fury X in almost all instances. And it has an MSRP of $379, and the Founders Edition is $449. You get all the features and technologies that were launched with the GTX 1080. You get all the kind of added benefits of fast sync and SMP and the VR changes that we've talked about over and over again. But it's a very impressive product. June 10th is the actual availability of the GTX 1070. Again, just like with the 1080, my recommendation to you is the Founders Edition is a fantastic card. It's a high quality card. It's quiet. It cools the GPU very well. I think it looks very good. But if you can wait a little bit longer and save that $80 towards an add-in board vendor from EVGA or Asus or MSI or anybody at that point that gets to a card, gets the card down to that price point, you're going to feel a little bit better about your purchase in the long run. So again, NVIDIA has kind of stepped up their game. They have made the high end of the graphics card ecosystem very interesting. And the GTX 1080 and now the GTX 1070 are clearly ahead of everybody else in this field. Be sure to go to PCPer.com. We have the full review, all the pictures, all the diagrams, all the benchmarks, power measurements, performance per dollar measurements. All that stuff is very well detailed out in our written review, and I would encourage you to go take a look. Thanks, everyone.
If you enjoyed this content, consider supporting in-depth technical content by contributing at patreon.com/PCPer.